Good morning. I would like to share over the next few weeks before Purim some insights from a very interesting pirush, a very interesting commentary that I discovered over the last couple of years on Megillas Esther. The name of the commentary is Ateres Zahav. It was written by Rav Chaim Cohen from Syria. He was a student of Rav Chaim Vital, the primary student of the Arizal. And from a recently discovered manuscript, they published 2 volumes of his commentary on the Megillah. One volume is referred to as the Pshat volume. I wouldn't exactly, frankly, refer to it as Pshat. I would not refer to it as Pshat myself, but it's kind of Pshat mixed with Drush is how I would describe it, giving his very interesting ways of viewing the story of the Megillah. And the second volume is mainly focused on his Kabbalistic insights, although there's plenty mixed up in there as well, not just Kabbalistic insights. As I said, I'm going to try to share the points and the principles that he discusses as far as the Megillah is concerned. Just to give you a little bit of an overview of how he views the story of the Megillah, he sees it as being sort of like an existential struggle between the forces of good and the forces of evil. In the Pshat commentary, and again, this is not his own chiddush, but he focuses very much on the idea that prior to the story of the Megillah, let's just, for those of you who aren't familiar, give a little bit of historical background. The Megillas Esther takes place during the 70 years of the Babylonian Empire, between the destruction of the empire by Nebuchadnezzar and the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash 70 years later. However, 18 years before the Beis HaMikdash was ultimately rebuilt, the Jewish people were given permission by Koresh, by Cyrus, to start rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash, but it was later rescinded. And Achashverosh did not allow the Beis HaMikdash to be rebuilt. And for those of you who are familiar with a lot of the Midrashim, you know this idea already, right? When Esther says that she wants Chatzi Hamalchus, that she would like half the kingdom, that's explained that she was asking Achashverosh for everything but the building of the Beis HaMikdash. But as we'll see, the commentary focuses in a number of places on this tension about the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash. In the Sod commentary, in the Kabbalistic commentary, he sees it more that in a spiritual context, the main spiritual forces in the world and the forces of goodness in a state of tikkun, when existence is in a state of rectification, then all of goodness is bestowed on the world through Klal Yisrael, through the Jewish nation. And we are the custodians of that good, and then we share it with everybody else. And it's all on the side of Kedusha, the side of holiness. But when we're in a state of churban, a state of destruction, then it all goes to the Sitra Achra, literally the other side. And we'll see how he describes the Sitra Achra taking over those forces and diverting it to its own needs. And I went through his commentary, took extensive notes. Again, both the Pshat commentary as well as the Kabbalistic commentary. By no means am I trying to share with you the entirety of his commentary. Each volume is hundreds of pages long. I picked and chose different ideas as I saw them in the commentary, and there's a lot more there than that which I'm sharing with you. So the first pasuk in the Megillah begins, "Vayihi b'mei Achashverosh," and it was in the days of Achashverosh. Hu Achashverosh, he was Achashverosh Hamolech, who ruled Mehodu va'ad Kush. So there's two questions that he focuses on over here. Number one, that the pasuk seems to be a bit redundant. Vayihi b'mei Achashverosh, it was in the days of Achashverosh. He was Achashverosh who ruled. So those words, hu Achashverosh, seem to be extra. You could have just said it was in the days of Achashverosh, who ruled from Hodu to Kush. Secondly, the word Hamolech, who ruled or who reigned, it should have the letter Vav in there because it's pronounced Mo Hamolech with the sound of a cholam. And that cholam really should be accompanied with the letter Vav. But that letter Vav is missing, almost as if it said Hamelech, not Hamolech. So why is that letter Vav missing? And to understand this, he explains that the point is to tell you, you'll notice also in that first pasuk, the first verse, it never refers to him as it does later on in the Megillah, as Melech Achashverosh, King Achashverosh. It refers to him twice as Achashverosh without bothering to give him his title. And he explains that the point is to tell you that Achashverosh never really truly attained the status of royalty. It was in the days of Achashverosh. Who Achashverosh? It's the same Achashverosh as he always was. He never changed, never developed into true trappings of royalty. And that's why the word Hamolech, who ruled, is missing a Vav to tell you that even though he got the title of king, but there was always something missing. He might have been ruler over 127 provinces, but at every moment of his rule and in every one of those provinces, something was lacking. Besides which also, there were Jews in every single one of the 127 provinces over which Achashverosh ruled, and they never really accepted Achashverosh as king. As far as they were concerned, it was only the Melech Malchei Hamlochim, the King of Kings, who was the real king. The Gemara tells us that whenever the pasuk uses the word Vayehi, which is how the Megillah begins, it's always a term to mean something bad is about to happen. And whenever it says V'hoya to begin the story, and it was, it's always a term indicating joy. So why does the word Vayihi indicate suffering and V'hoya indicate joy? And he explains that Hashem always brings the cure before Hashem brings the suffering. And that's why it begins with the word Vayihi, and it was, in a past tense, to tell you that even at the time when you're feeling the suffering acutely, when Klal Yisrael was feeling the suffering of the Purim threat acutely, it was already in the past tense, because Hashem had already created the cure for that suffering. And even though when you look at it, all you see is suffering, but if you know how to look at it with the right outlook, you'll see that there isn't really a suffering because the cure is already in place. That's why also the pasuk, B'chol tsarasam lo tsar, in all of the suffering of the people. So the word lo is written with an aleph, which literally means that in all of the suffering, there is no suffering. But we read it, or we're meant to understand it on the pshat level, as if the word lo was with a vav, to say that when all of the suffering, he, meaning Hashem, suffers as well. But the Ateres Zahav explains that the reason why it's written with an aleph, that there is no suffering, is the same thing. That even though we see and perceive suffering, but in truth, the salvation is already there. But whenever it's a time of joy, then it's always written v'haya in the future tense, because we always join Hashem together with us in our joy, and therefore that turns it into an eternal joy that's going to last forever. We mentioned beforehand the idea that Vayhi b'mei Achashverosh, true Achashverosh, is there to tell you that he was the same Achashverosh from beginning to end. So he points out that a few years before the Purim story began, Achashverosh had stopped the building of the Beis HaMikdash. Why did he stop it? So most of the people said it had nothing to do with Achashverosh being an anti-Semite. Rather, they ascribed it to the fact that Achashverosh had great imperialistic ambitions, and therefore he didn't want to take any chance of any of the nations under his control to start having ambitions for independence. And his quashing of the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash was therefore purely for political reasons and not due to any anti-Semitism. However, in the Purim story, his true feelings towards the Jewish people became evident. As the Gemara points out, that he had a greater hatred to the Jewish people than that of Haman. So that's what the pasuk is trying to tell you. This was in the days of Achashverosh. He was Achashverosh. It's the same Achashverosh from beginning to end. Meaning what you wanted to interpret a few years ago as a decision born out of political necessity, that decision was also predicated upon Achashverosh's anti-Semitism. There's a Gemara that asks, how did Esther, ma zochsa Esther, and the conventional way of understanding that is, how did Esther merit to rule over 127 provinces? But Hashem said that Esther, who was a descendant of Sarah, who lived 127 years, should come and rule over 127 provinces. So it was time for the Geula, it was time for the redemption. It was time for the Beis HaMikdash to be rebuilt. And Achashverosh stopped it. Hashem needed a way to put an end to Achashverosh and his monarchy. And only Esther was up to the task. He explains that ma zochsa, which we said in the conventional understanding would be how did Esther merit, but zochsa can also be understood to mean victorious. How was Esther victorious to become the real ruler over the 127 provinces, to the extent that she had power of life and death over the people in those provinces? Keep in mind, there was no picnic for Esther to be married to Achashverosh. But it was not a punishment. Hashem didn't create the machinations for Esther to be married for Achashverosh because Esther had done something wrong and deserved the punishment. She was chosen because that Hashem had to find someone who had the power to overcome and dominate the rush of the wicked Achashverosh from climbing all over the Mizbeach, the altar in the Beis HaMikdash. And that's why he found a descendant of Sarah, someone who emulated the ways of Sarah. How do we find that she was similar to Sarah? Because Sarah, we know, was taken to Paro. And Paro was punished for having taken Sarah. Similar thing happened with Avimelech, when Avimelech took Sarah. So too, Esther was similar in the fact that she was also taken to a king who ended up paying a serious price for that. Furthermore, just as in the case of Sarah, both when she was taken by Pharaoh, as well as later on when she was taken by Avimelech, neither of them ever touched her. The same thing was true of Esther. The Zohar says that a shade was created and took the place in bed of Esther whenever Achashverosh wanted her. And as we mentioned beforehand, just as there were consequences for Paro and Avimelech, so too Achashverosh suffered consequences by taking Esther, because the result was that over 80,000 members of his kingdom were killed because of what he tried to do to the Jewish people. Okay, we will end this piece over here, and Emir Hashem, God willing, will continue with some more over the next few weeks. Thanks for listening.